Okay, picking up where we left off. Where is the border? There are borders all over the place, but when we say the border in a US cultural and political discourse, we tend to mean like the border with a capital T and a capital B. We tend to mean the southern border with Mexico, right? This has not always been the case, as we talked about in the last lecture. For instance, for the beginning of the US, it was the western frontier that was much more politically significant. And in Butler's text, we've got the California-Oregon border being spotlighted as this like miniaturized scale model of anti-migration policy, policing, and things like that. But it's like all within the U.S. But also it calls back to a time when California was part of Mexico, and the U.S.-Mexico border was very literally between Oregon and California. Right, and that brings us to Aztlan. So as Gloria Anzaldua writes about, Aztlan is this traditional Chicano homeland. And Chicano, as Anzaldua gets into, Chicano is like a word for this mestizo identity that is a combination of indigenous roots and white roots. Usually like Spanish heritage and indigenous heritage, within Mexico, but also with like southwestern ties, especially if mestizo people from Mexico move north and form families with indigenous people in the Southwest or with white settlers in the U.S. Like this is all part of Chicanidad, and so it's this very complicated mixed identity, right? And the traditional Chicano homeland is Aztlan, which is most of the Southwest. It's the homeland of the ancestors of the Aztecs. It's where the Aztecs originate and come from before they migrate down south to the Sonoran Desert. It's also the homelands of a bunch of indigenous communities, Pueblo peoples, the Diné, that should have an accent, I'm sorry, the Hopi, the Comanche, the Ute, the Paiute, etc., etc. A lot of people are from the Southwest. And it's still the territories of these people, right? It's just been claimed by a bunch of states and empires. First Spain in the 1600s, then it was liberated in the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, then the Reconquista happens and it's recolonized by Spain, then it's part of Mexico post-Mexican independence, and then post-Guadalupe Hidalgo, it's part of the US. And so Aztlan is a very complicated region, and it speaks to this complicated Chicano history, right? Because people think about it as a homeland in a lot of conflicting ways, right? Because it's often framed as this traditional homeland of the Aztecs, but also as part of Mexico, right? As when Anzaldua writes about Aztlan or the other Mexico, she's writing about like the othering of the two Mexicos that exist on two sides of this border. So it's this very complicated history, right? Because Mexico is also a colonial state on a homeland that belongs to a bunch of indigenous. So it's very complicated, right? And it's very complicated in general, Chicanidad, because of the conflict between these different aspects of people's ancestry and heritage. So a bit on Gloria Anzaldua, because she's a really, really important figure in Chicano writing. She's like the quintessential Chicano lesbian feminist, or one of the quintessential Chicano lesbian feminists. She wrote a lot, but her most famous work is this book, Borderlands La Frontera, The New Mestiza, which is all about mestizaje and femininity. It's all about the intersections of sexuality and queerness, language, and mixed identity around being Chicana and being Tejana, so a Chicano woman from Texas. And in general, like being of indigenous descent and growing up in the area surrounding the US-Mexico border. And it's this great combination of autoethnographic writing, memoir, theory, political analysis, history, and poetry. And so as you notice, she writes in prose and poetry, and she also writes in Spanish, but also English. And she has this particular dialect of Tejana, Spanish and English combination And she has a whole piece just on language that I highly recommend. It's called How to Tame a Wild Tongue, and it's on language and queerness, and it's really, really cool and interesting. And it's also part of the same book. So check it out if you liked this piece, because if you like this piece, you'll probably like her other writing too. And she and Butler sort of focus on some of the same aspects of what migration means for racialized women migrating, right? Um, Anzaldua writes, La mojada, la mujer indocumentada, is doubly threatened in this country. Not only does she have to contend with sexual violence, but like all women, she is prey to a sense of physical helplessness. As a refugee, she leaves the familiar and safe home ground to venture into unknown and possibly dangerous terrain. This is her home, the thin edge of barbed wire. And then Butler writes about, and this is all from that period of the book where Dara, Henry, and Lauren are all, his name's Harry, but sorry. Uh, when you've been speaking for long enough, you lose the ability to enunciate. That's what the seltzer is for. Okay. When Harry, Sarah, and Lauren are all, oh no, my computer's gonna die. Ah! I'm just gonna grab a computer charger. Don't mind me. Ah, okay. I'm not even gonna try to edit that out because last week that didn't go very well. And I'm not very good at video editing. I'm a teacher, not an editor. So we're just gonna leave that awkward moment in there, and that's okay. All right. So yeah, when Zara, Lauren, and Harry are all have when they've had to leave Robledo because of the fires, and they're sort of journeying northwards with hopes of finding employment and a way to live in Oregon, Washington, or Canada. Um, and so Lauren says, I was thinking of traveling as a man. I said to him, he seemed to be repressing a smile. That will be safer for you. And then Lauren, in observing other people who, like, well, they all have to be on watch while they're traveling. Lauren observes these two men and she says, or she thinks to herself, two big, dirty looking guys were standing nearby watching us, watching Zara in particular. These guys were too close to us. They meant to be too close. And this is sort of acknowledging like the particular threats that Zara faces as like a traditionally attractive woman who is also presenting as a woman on this journey and who has faced like a lot of sexual violence and trafficking already in her life. Um, and so Butler, in the writing that she does about migration and this journey that these characters go on, is really getting at these real themes that migrant women face, especially racialized women. Um, Anzaldua also sort of like presents this portrait of the broader border beyond just the line, right? Because when we talk about borders, often we reduce them to the place that it is, which is like the literal line on the map. The border is a lot more complicated than that, and it's also a lot bigger than that. The US-Mexican border es una herida abierta where the third world grates against the first and bleeds, and before a scab forms it hemorrhages again. The lifeblood of two worlds merging to form a third country. Border culture. Borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe to distinguish us from them. A border is a dividing line, a narrow strip along a steep edge. A borderland is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. It is a constant state of transition, the prohibited and forbidden are its inhabitants. This is a really important statement because it's sort of like really gets at the idea that there's more to the border than just the line. Like the line is very important here. It's this sharp edge, but also that sharp edge cuts this wound, right? This hemorrhaging wound into two places and creates this third place between them that is never in state. It's always in motion. It's always changing, and it's always a site of boundaries and designations of like, oh, you're unsafe, or oh, you're not like us, or being unwelcome and being prohibited. And this is all really important because these are the themes that we see come up again and again in the policing of the border. Um, and also this idea that the border is an undetermined place that transcends the literal line. And this is why the book is called Borderlands, right? Because she's writing about the border beyond the border. This idea that the border is bigger than just that line kind of echoes throughout Anzaldua's text, and it also kind of echoes throughout the reality of how the border works in our world, right? So Anzaldua writes on La Crisis, which is this economic dependency and devaluation of Mexican currency that feeds this feedback loop of migration. The gringos had not stopped at the border. By the end of the 19th century, powerful landowners in Mexico, in partnership with U.S. colonizing companies, had dispossessed millions of Indians of their lands. Currently, Mexico and her 80 million citizens are almost completely dependent on the U.S. market. So we have this like much broader effect of border policy, economic power, capitalism and industry, and land disposition. They all go hand in hand in creating a system wherein the whole country economically depends on, and all of the families that make up that country depend economically on a market in a foreign country. And so it creates this like transnational flow of economic dependence that feeds into who crosses the border when and why. And as such, it brings the focus of the border from the line in the sand into individual homes and families and into the broader national conversation, right? The border becomes a defining feature of life. And so we get this world where the decision whether or not to cross the border becomes a structuring aspect of life. So Anzaldua continues, for many Mexicanos del otro lado, the choice is to stay in Mexico and starve or move north and live. Dice que cada mexicano siempre sueña de la conquista en los brazos de cuatro gringas rubias, la conquista del país poderoso del norte de los Estados Unidos. En cada chicano y mexicano vive el mito de tesoro territorial perdido. North Americans call this return to the homeland the silent invasion. And then she continues, expanding on this idea by talking about how not just the concept of the border and like the necessity of reckoning with whether or not this is forced hand of whether or not to try crossing it, but also like the policing of the border extends beyond as well. So when people cross the border, they get to this traditional homeland, right? But then she writes, as refugees in a homeland that does not want them, many find a welcome hand holding out only suffering, pain, and ignoble death. Those who make it past the checking points of the Border Patrol find themselves in the midst of 150 years of racism in Chicano barrios in the Southwest and in big northern cities, living in a no-man's borderland, caught between being treated as criminals and being able to eat. Between resistance and deportation, the illegal refugees are some of the poorest and the most exploited of any people in the U.S. It is illegal for Mexicans to work without green cards, but big farming combines farm bosses and smugglers who bring them in, make money off of the, I'm not going to say a slur, it's labor. They don't have to pay federal minimum wages or ensure adequate housing or sanitary conditions. And so, yeah, if your workers aren't documented, you don't have to pay them federal minimum wages because there's nobody who can check up on that, because what are they going to do? Say, hey, you're breaking the law by not paying me minimum wages. That puts them at risk of being deported. And so this is kind of how the economy profits off of the labor of undocumented workers. And also, you sort of see that a policing of existence transcends just the checkpoints itself and is part of the structures of the broader borderland of the barrio and of cities where people are working and farms where people are working, right? It all becomes a borderland. It's impossible to escape the borderland and the policing that comes with Border Patrol. And we see this very, very blatantly in our everyday reality right now, right? In this era of arbitrary detention. And we sort of see this with like the heyday of surveillance technology, right, which we're going to talk about in the final week. We're going to talk about flock cameras, which, for those of you who aren't aware, flock cameras are automated license plate readers. That there used to be a bunch of them posted up on like poles around town. Those ones mostly got taken down because of public pushback, but there's still a lot of them up on traffic stops. Like there's one on the corner of, I walked by it today. There's one on the corner of Kirkwood. I forget what the cross street is, but it's by the Soma on Kirkwood. There's one on that street pole. And people will sometimes write little chalk messages pointing to it. But if you look up there, it's like shaped like a little globe, and it's on the street pole. And what these do is these read your license plate and they put it in a database so they can kind of track where everybody's cars are at all times of day, anytime you drive by one. And it goes into a database that can be searched by any government agency. And so ICE searches this a lot and uses it to track people. And they also use facial recognition cameras and increasingly militarized agents who sort of like infiltrate communities and kidnap people arbitrarily at this point, right? Because we're in an era where there's a policy of trying to arrest and deport anybody. So the policing of the border extends far beyond a literal border into everywhere. With this in mind, there's a really useful concept called state of exception. This concept comes from, the term was originally used by somebody in Nazi Germany, so that's kind of horrifying, but it was popularized in this particular argument that we're going to talk about by a very famous Italian philosopher named Giorgio Agamben in the book State of Exception. And he takes this older term and makes this argument, which is that, so the term it refers to a place or a time or a context in which your usual rights are suspended and don't apply. So that's what the concept of a state of exception is. An example from everyday life that we kind of take for granted is at the airport. When you go to get on a plane, you can't just go get on a plane. You used to be able to just go get on a plane before 2001. But after 9/11, we had this increase of airport security and this like increase of general like supervision and fear around like what people are bringing onto planes. So there became this like TSA model where people's bags are searched. You have to take your shoes off, your belt, your keys, all of that, and you subject your body to an electronic scanner, and then you can get patted down or searched. This is not something that we would put up with if somebody told us that we had to, like, randomly in our daily life, right? Like, say you went to Kroger and somebody stopped you at the door and said, hey, you have to take your shoes off and go through this body scanner and get patted down to go to the Kroger. You'd probably be like, what the heck? No, I'm not going to do that, because you know that you have rights against arbitrary search and seizure. However, we accept that those rights are waived when we get into the TSA line at the airport, because national security. But Agamben argues that the problem with this is that the minute our rights can be suspended in one context, say at an airport, then they become liable for further suspension in additional contexts, right? What's stopping the government from passing a law that says such searches are now necessary for grocery stores, for national security reasons, or for schools, or for hospitals, in the same way that the government passed the laws that necessitated them before air travel, right? What is stopping further suspension of these rights? Or for that matter, tracking where we go via the network of cameras logging our license plates that is searchable by agencies. In other words, the very possibility of a state of exception and the very existence of these contexts and places where our rights are no longer inalienable. Another example would be the border, right? If you're crossing the border, even between some states, right? If you were to drive from Indiana to my home state of California, you would be stopped at the state border. And border, like the state police would say, hey, do you have any fruit in your car? And they could arbitrarily, or because they didn't believe you, decide to search your vehicle for fruit, because the threat of fruit pathogens is such a threat to the economy and the food supply in a big farming state like California, that your rights are considered not as important as stopping fruit pathogens via people coming in, via people smuggling in unapproved apples. So, not just apples, that's just an example. Anyway, borders are another example of states of exception. But the thing is, the very existence of a state of exception means that states of exception are possible, which means that your rights in general can be suspended, which means that the only thing stopping your rights from being suspended in general is that nobody's tried to suspend them yet. You're always already living in the state of exception. Border is a state of exception. The border is everywhere. And the state of exception is everywhere. So anyway, if you want to know more about that argument, I recommend reading the Agamben book. It's theory, so it's not exactly like the most fun reading, but it's interesting stuff. I have not read the whole thing, I'm not going to lie. But it is, I've read some because it's a significant concept. Pivoting to more recent history and talking about the timeline of ICE and how we got to where we are today, because it's very important for us to acknowledge. If you have questions about this and you want to talk about it more, feel free to come to my office hours. I'm happy to discuss it more and to provide additional resources or readings, or just listen if you want to talk. But it's important for us to talk about this history and what's happening today. In 2003, ICE is founded. It's a replacement for something that predated it, which was called the Immigration and Naturalization Service. And it's the much more militarized, national security focused version of that prior thing. So it's much more focused on targeting migrants rather than just managing immigration and naturalization. It's focused on targeting migrants as supposed threats to national security, and it's focused on detaining people and then deporting them. And sometimes people are detained for a very long time, often in private prison facilities, as we see today. So it was founded in 2003, and this is as part of the broader pivot towards increasing militarization in the face of national security threats and perceived threats to national security following 9/11. And then in 2004, we had 32 people die in ICE custody, due largely to the conditions in these detention centers, where we'll get into it more when we talk about the second supplemental reading for today. But then in 2008, the Great Recession strikes, and there's a massive decrease in undocumented migration in the same way that we saw with previous economic downturns. And then in the 2010s, based on previous patterns, you might have expected to see an uptick back in undocumented Mexican immigration, but you actually see a continuing decrease. At this point, the majority of undocumented migrants are coming from Central America. But because of the history and prevalence of anti-Mexican immigrant rhetoric and the particular combination of economic and racial and political fear that comes from having a country right next to this country that has this history of previously having fought wars and previously posing this threat, the narrative of undocumented migrants as criminal illegal aliens coming specifically from Mexico continues to be the dominant narrative, even though not only was that always a racist stereotype, there aren't even that many people coming from Mexico. It's just people coming through Mexico, but the nuance is lost in this racist discourse. In 2012, we see the initiative called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals begin. This is also called the Dreamer Program. It protected people who came to the U.S. as children from deportation and gave them work authorizations. This was a really massive program. It was just shut down by the Trump administration earlier on in the second Trump administration. It was under threat since the first Trump administration, but it was shut down recently. The DACA sort of status was revoked. So everybody who grew up with this protection, it was taken from them quite recently. But yeah, for quite a while, what this would do is if you came to the US as a child, you would not be deportable. You would be given this legal protection. It's not the same as citizenship or documentation. It's not the same as other kinds of visas, but it is a kind of recognition and like, you're still undocumented, but you have this special protection. And so it's this special legal category that gives people like some amount of security and protection and work authorizations, and it allows people to like go to school and get jobs and like build a life. In the 2010s, the Obama administration breaks deportation records and deports nearly 3 million people between 2009 and 2016. And then in 2017, after Trump takes office, he begins testing a family separation policy. You may have heard about this back in 2016, although y'all were most of y'all were pretty young then, so I'm not sure how much this was on your radar during that era, but it started as a test pilot program in El Paso, Texas, where families detained at the border and families detained in general by ICE were split up. And the parents and children were sent to different facilities, and neither would have any idea where the other was. This became federal policy in 2018 and continued throughout the Trump era, the Trump administration the first time, and also the Biden regime, despite the fact that Biden ran on a promise of stopping this policy. He never actually did. And then in 2025, Trump takes office for a second time, immediately raises the budget for ICE, begins recruiting people for ICE, and begins a widespread program of targeting all undocumented migrants across the country, specifically proactively by going into communities and seeking out people suspected of being undocumented and sort of casting a wide net. And what this leads to is a regime that puts in place policies that allow ICE to target anyone suspected of being undocumented, and specifically court cases allowing ICE to break a bunch of what were previously rules, like allowing them to target anybody for speaking Spanish, or allowing them to target people just based on skin color as a ground for detention. And a policy of detaining first and asking questions later, regardless of the kinds of identification people present. So even if people present their IDs and say, look, see, I have a visa, or look, see, I am here legally, or look, see, I am a citizen, they can still be detained by ICE. And nobody in ICE is getting any kind of like punishment for breaking, for detaining people when they don't have the Constitution, like when it's unconstitutional. Like nobody in ICE is being fired for detaining citizens or even deporting citizens. People are still encouraged to do that. The organization rewards people for massive numbers of detainees and does not punish people for detaining people who are citizens. So what you get is detention of people are kind of across the board, especially undocumented people, but also the detention of documented immigrants and citizens based on this racial profiling. And sometimes you get people who have visas being detained for political speech and then their visas canceled. So we see this happen with Mahmoud Khalil and Laka Kourdia, both of whom were Palestinian students who were detained by ICE in retribution for being very vocal faces of the pro-Palestinian student Intifada movement back in 2024. We also see a pivot where didn't put this on the slide for some reason, but previously, basically from the founding of ICE up until 2025, there was a rule in place where ICE was not allowed to target people in particular sensitive locations. I think it included churches, hospitals. It definitely included hospitals, and it's supposed to include schools as well. And the idea was you cannot detain people. You cannot go into a school, a hospital, or a church and detain somebody there. And that policy was just kind of thrown out in 2025. And that's when we saw ICE entering schools and hospitals and detaining students and patients and doctors and staff. And then 32 people die in ICE detention again in 2025. This is the highest death rate since 2004. Far fewer people were dying in the intervening years. And as the number of people being detained ramps up, the conditions and and as the oversight collapses around ICE in real time, we see a massive worsening in the conditions in the detention centers, which is saying a lot because the conditions were always quite bad. There's a history of forced sterilization happening in ICE detention in the mid 2010s. There have been all kinds of human rights concerns about ICE detention and the adequacy of things like food, water, and medical care access. But all of that has gotten worse since 2025, especially with the widespread militarized raids that we've been seeing, starting in cities like Los Angeles, Portland, and Chicago, and then most recently Minneapolis and St. Paul. We see ICE begin detaining people who are protesting them, not just and like anybody who gets in their way. We also see them start occupying former forts like Fort Snelling in the Twin Cities, occupying federal buildings, turning office spaces that were never supposed to be used to hold people long term into detention facilities, where people are sleeping on the floors, in bathrooms, and then they start buying up warehouses across the country and also building facilities like Alligator Alcatraz that are incredibly unsafe and flood frequently. And then in 2025, we see ICE begin shooting people in response to people following them and filming them, and also trying to run away from detention. So a young guy named Ruben Ray Martinez was shot to death trying to escape detention. And then a man named Keith Porter Jr. was shot to death for unclear reasons by an off-duty ICE agent. He was just like walking down the street. His daughter saw it happen, I believe. And then in 2026, we see the execution of three protesters, or two protesters. I don't know what. Oh, sorry. Yeah, two protesters, and I think one guy who was just trying to avoid detention. He was driving away, I believe. I'm not entirely sure on the details. This just happened like last week. So Renee Good and Alex Preddy were both shot to death in Minneapolis. They were either at protests against ICE filming, or filming ICE going about deportations as an attempt to try and like intervene in the deportations. Something known as ICE Watch that is becoming an increasingly prevalent response to this kind of increased ICE activity is people forming these neighborhood watches that go around and like film ICE, find out where they're going, follow them, and try and stop them from taking people. And this is what Renee Good was doing when she was shot. Alex Preddy was shot at a protest, and Lorenzo Salgado Araujo, I think he was just driving away from like ICE agents. I think he was trying to evade them, and he was shot to death. And in these last few cases, we see ICE using this narrative of like these people were threats to national security as a justification for their killings. And this is often in the context of arguing that people driving cars were trying to drive them into ICE agents, despite video evidence to the contrary. And it's a whole thing. That kind of takes us into the other article for today, which was this short piece from the conversation, which is a really cool blog for. It's like a news article site, but all of the articles are written by academics. They're just like more accessible than most research journals. So like it's the kind of things that people would write in like a research journal that's peer reviewed, but then they write sort of like more accessible, public facing, layperson language friendly versions for this website. And then it's like more accessible for anybody to read. So it's a really useful source for that reason. So anyway, this is kind of like a summary of the argument for viewing ICE detention facilities as concentration camps. And their argument Braithwaite and Van Nostrand's argument relies on 4 criteria for what a concentration camp entails. And these are based on these 4 criteria are shared amongst the 150 historical examples that they looked into, right? Because this is a write-up of a larger research project. And so what they did was these academics, along with their research teams, they looked into 150 examples of concentration camps across time, including the obvious example from the Holocaust, but also we've got the internment camps where Japanese American citizens were incarcerated during World War II after Pearl Harbor. We've got a bunch of examples from the war on Ukraine, from where Uyghur and Rohingya people are being concentrated. We've got a ton of examples, and all of these examples had these 4 criteria in common. One is the concentration of large numbers of targeted civilians into spaces. So pick a space and you target a group of people, a group of civilians, and you concentrate them into that space. Civilians, not military prisoners, right? 2 is that those spaces are secured by small numbers of captors who control the entry and exit points and who gets to come and go. 3, that these concentration camps operate outside of legal frameworks that regulate prisons, refugee camps, and immigration detention centers. Concentration camps are run by separate authorities that deny detainees due process, such as formal criminal charges, legal representation, or fair trial. That's really important for this context, because when they say operate outside of legal frameworks that regulate immigration detention centers, they don't mean that don't call themselves immigration detention centers, right? They mean literally there are legal frameworks that govern how an immigration detention center should work based on the immigration laws in that state. And these facilities are not operating under those laws. And there's more on that in the next slide. And then the 4th one is the presence of squalor and routine violence. Evidence that detainees regularly experienced at least 2 forms of abuse, including but not limited to torture, beatings, mass killing, sexual violence, psychological abuse, lack of food, lack of water, lack of shelter, lack of health care, overcrowding, and spread of disease. They don't go into the details of this in this article, but there is quite a lot of evidence that a lot of these forms of abuse are ongoing in ICE detention facilities, right? So their argument about this 3rd criteria is really significant, because these facilities are technically immigration detention facilities in that they are run by immigration agencies to detain migrants, but they're not actually operating under the legal frameworks that are supposed to govern those, right? Migrants do have rights. Even undocumented migrants have rights. Due process under the law. They get trials. They get legal representation. And they're supposed to have access to make a case for why they should be allowed to stay. People, and then in addition to undocumented people having these rights, documented people have rights, and naturalized citizens have rights. Visas are not supposed to just be arbitrarily cancelable. And the ways in which, and people are not supposed to be disappeared from outside of immigration court and put into detention. This is not how. And Braithwaite and Van Nostrand get into this a bit when they say that the way ICE facilities are working in 2025 and 2026 is not how these facilities historically worked. They were always relatively brutal and cruel. They always had people dying in them. 2025 killed exactly as many people as 2004 did. They've always had a death rate, and they've always had violence, and especially under the family separation policy, they've always been harmful, but they do not operate with respect to the legal rights of the people being held in them. Most people held in there have not had their hearings. They have not had access to lawyers or contact with their families, including kids are being denied contact with their parents if the kids have been detained and the parents have not, and vice versa. People's parents have been detained and then denied access to contacting their children who are still on the outside. And this does not actually obey the laws that on paper govern immigration facility function in this country. So for that reason, the third criterion applies in this case. So this is the class on futurism. Unlike a lot of what we read, though, when we talk about immigration in 2026, we're not really discussing speculative futures so much as a very charged moment in time that will dramatically shape the future, right? This is one of those moments where we are living through something that will be in the history books. This is going to define this era in a lot of ways for the future. And so it's very hard to say what that future will look like because we're not really speculating, we're living through it being shaped in a very like fast and heavy way with very real life or death stakes. And that's always been the case, but it's like a lot more so than the other things we're talking about. This is like happening in real time right now. And so we can't predict the future, but what we can look at is some different projections of possible futures based on like Butler's novel, right? We can read that as a warning for what the future can look like if we don't address climate change and racism, and economic inequality. We can look at the historical examples in Braithwaite and Van Nostrand's article, and we can see in these other concentration camps and what has come of them warnings for our own future, right? Because history doesn't strictly repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And in contrast, Anzaldua presents an alternative possibility in her poetry, right? When she writes, "This is my home, the thin edge of barbed wire, but the skin of the earth is seamless, the sea cannot be fenced, El Mar does not stop at borders." To show the white man what she thought of his arrogance, Yemaya blew that wire fence down. Yemaya, by the way, is a um oh no, I'm blanking on the word. She's a deity from Santeria, which is like a syncretic religion from sort of like the Caribbean, in particular, like the Caribbean and some parts of the Americas, like Mexico has some Santeria, and then like Haiti, the Dominican Republic, some Santeria, and then Puerto Rico especially has Santeria, and it's sort of like a syncretic religion that combines some elements of Catholicism from Spanish colonialism and some elements of Yoruba religion from Africa, from enslavement. Oh, I hate that I'm blanking on the word for the deities, but Yemaya is a deity. Uh, from Santeria. This land was Mexican once, was Indian always, and is and will be again. So this is right. Anzaldua is writing in this poem an alternate future, one of return, and one where borders do not limit life and are not the end all be all of people getting to go home. And I don't know. There's maybe something hopeful in that. Um, it didn't feel appropriate to talk about this without acknowledging all of the people who've died so far this year, either in ICE detention or killed by ICE, either shot by ICE or run over by ICE, who were breaking traffic laws while chasing people. In the case of Dr. Linda Davis, so it feels it feels important to acknowledge. And have a moment of silence for all of these people who've died since New Year's of 2025, as of today, 7/12/26. On that note, here's some additional sources, and I will get your reading reflection grades in, shortly, in the next day or so. They've all been spectacular so far. I'm about halfway through grading this next batch, and then for your draft of the final project. That's coming up at the end of this week, ish. It's going to be fine. I am not looking for anything particularly formal. All that I ask is that you cite your sources and that you engage with sources. And other than that, you can write whatever you want. It can be, oh, and that you don't use AI. Please don't use AI. It's so boring to read AI papers. I want to read what you have to say. It can be anything. You can write an argumentative piece about what you think of some of these arguments for a future. You can write an analytical piece analyzing some of the texts that we've read. You can write a historical piece. You can, as long as it engages with like ideas about futurity in some way, or you can write a piece of speculative futurism. You can be creative with it. Have fun and let your voice shine through. And I will get you comments on your drafts. And I will prioritize that above all else so that you get those comments very quickly, because they'll be important for like how you proceed in writing the final version. And yeah, I expect that you'll all do really well. But you can come to my office hours if you have any questions or concerns or you want to talk it through. As usual, they'll be on Wednesday at 2 p.m. And in case you're out of town while taking this class, that's 2 p.m. Eastern time. But you can also email me to make an appointment. I have availability almost every day of the week, especially in the evenings and the night. So I take care, and I'll see you next time.